I'm Margaret Chen, and at 68 years old, I watched my husband's secret daughter break down in my kitchen as she confessed their plan to end my life. The Alzheimer's diagnosis was supposed to make me vulnerable, confused, easy to manipulate. What they didn't count on was that losing some memories had sharpened others, and their whispered conversations in the hallway, their careful questions about my medication, their sudden interest in my will, had all been catalogued in the one place my diseased mind protected most fiercely: my survival instinct. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The tears streaming down Jessica's face as she begged for my forgiveness weren't for the conspiracy itself, but because their perfect plan had been unraveling for weeks, and I had been 3 steps ahead of them the entire time. You see, when your mind starts playing tricks on you, you learn to trust evidence over memory, documentation over feelings, and recorded conversations over promises. Let me tell you how a woman with early-stage Alzheimer's outwitted 2 people who thought her condition made her the perfect victim. This story begins not with my diagnosis, but with a marriage that I thought was built on 42 years of trust, companionship, and shared dreams. Robert Chen had been my anchor through graduate school when I earned my master's in library science, my cheerleader when I took the head librarian position at Riverside Central Library, and my comfort when we learned we couldn't have children of our own. Our home on Maple Street had been our sanctuary for 3 decades, a 2-story colonial that we'd painted together, gardened together, and filled with the quiet contentment of 2 people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. The mortgage had been paid off 15 years ago, and our retirement savings, combined with the house value and Robert's life insurance policy, meant we were comfortable. Not wealthy, but secure enough to face our golden years without financial worry. Robert worked as an insurance adjuster for 37 years, a job that required meticulous attention to detail and an ability to spot inconsistencies in people's stories. The irony of this skill set wouldn't become apparent until much later. He was methodical in everything, from organizing his workshop in the garage to planning our annual vacations to the Oregon coast. We had routines that worked for us: dinner at 6, evening news at 7, weekend trips to the farmer's market, Sunday dinners with my sister Helen. The first signs of my cognitive decline appeared subtly about 18 months ago. I'd lose my keys more frequently, forget appointments I'd made just days before, or find myself standing in rooms unable to remember why I'd entered. Initially, we attributed these lapses to normal aging, stress from retirement adjustment, or simple distraction. Robert was patient during these moments, helping me retrace my steps, gently reminding me of forgotten commitments, never making me feel inadequate or embarrassed. The diagnosis came 8 months ago after a series of increasingly concerning episodes. Dr. Sarah Mitchell at Riverside Medical Center conducted extensive cognitive testing, brain imaging, and neurological examinations before delivering the news that would reshape our lives completely. Early-stage Alzheimer's disease, she explained, with probable progression over the next several years. The initial impact was devastating, not just for me but for Robert, who held my hand tightly as Dr. Mitchell outlined treatment options, lifestyle modifications, and the importance of legal planning while I still maintained decision-making capacity. The weeks following the diagnosis were a whirlwind of activity. We consulted with Michael Rodriguez, an estate attorney who specialized in elder law, to ensure our wills were updated and medical directives were properly documented. Robert insisted on handling most of these details, claiming he wanted to protect me from additional stress. At the time, his protectiveness felt loving and appropriate. He scheduled my medical appointments, organized my medications in daily pill containers, and even began managing our finances more actively, explaining that he didn't want me to worry about complicated paperwork. Our social circle responded with varying degrees of comfort and awkwardness. Some friends rallied around us with practical support and emotional encouragement. Others seemed to fade away, perhaps uncomfortable with the reality of cognitive decline or uncertain about how to interact with someone whose mind was changing. Dorothy Williams, our neighbor of 20 years, became an unexpected pillar of strength. She'd stop by for coffee most mornings, helping me maintain familiar routines and providing companionship when Robert was out running errands or attending to business matters. The changes in my daily experience were subtle but persistent. Simple tasks that had once been automatic now required conscious effort and planning. I began writing detailed notes to myself, keeping calendars with excessive detail, and creating systems to compensate for my unreliable memory. Paradoxically, these adaptations made me more observant of my environment and more attuned to changes in routine or behavior patterns around me. About 6 months after the diagnosis, I began noticing phone calls that Robert would take in the garage or outside, conversations that ended abruptly when I entered the room, and occasional unexplained absences that he attributed to errands or medical appointments of his own. When I asked about these activities, he'd provide reasonable explanations with the patience of someone accustomed to repeating information for a forgetful spouse. The logical part of my mind accepted these explanations, but something deeper, some primitive warning system, began cataloging these irregularities. The first concrete anomaly appeared during a routine review of our bank statements. Robert had always handled the majority of our finances, but I maintained awareness of our major accounts and typical spending patterns. While reviewing the monthly statements, I noticed several withdrawals of exactly $500, always on Wednesdays, always from the same ATM across town. When I mentioned these transactions, Robert explained that he'd been helping his brother Thomas with some temporary financial difficulties, lending him money that would be repaid once Thomas resolved some insurance issues from a minor car accident. The explanation was plausible, and Robert's relationship with his brother had always included occasional financial assistance in both directions. However, the regularity and specific timing of these withdrawals struck me as unusual. Thomas lived only 15 minutes away and had never required such systematic financial support. More puzzling was Robert's insistence on driving across town to a specific ATM rather than using our local bank or simply writing a check. My growing suspicions felt almost paranoid, a sensation that was particularly troubling given my diagnosis. Was this increased distrust a symptom of my cognitive decline? Or was my subconscious detecting genuine inconsistencies in Robert's behavior? The uncertainty was maddening, but I decided to trust my instincts while maintaining careful documentation of anything that seemed irregular. During this period, I also began noticing changes in Robert's social patterns. He'd always been somewhat private about his friendships and professional relationships, but now there seemed to be entire categories of his life that were completely opaque to me. He'd receive text messages that he'd read quickly before deleting, make brief phone calls from the car while supposedly running errands, and occasionally return from these trips with subtle changes in mood or energy that suggested significant conversations or encounters had occurred. The most unsettling development was Robert's gradually increasing interest in my medical care and treatment protocols. He began attending all my appointments with Dr. Mitchell, asking detailed questions about my medications, prognosis, and the expected timeline of my cognitive decline. While spousal involvement in medical care is normal and appropriate, Robert's questions had a clinical quality that seemed to focus particularly on the progression of. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story of my condition and the eventual loss of my decision-making capabilities. During one appointment, Robert asked Dr. Mitchell about power of attorney activation, guardianship procedures, and the legal standards for determining when someone with Alzheimer's could no longer manage their own affairs. These were legitimate concerns for any spouse facing this situation, but the timing and specificity of his questions triggered additional unease. Dr. Mitchell provided thorough answers while emphasizing that I remained fully capable of making my own decisions and would likely maintain this capacity for several years with proper treatment and support. After that appointment, Robert seemed almost disappointed by Dr. Mitchell's optimistic assessment of my current cognitive status. That evening, he made several phone calls from the garage, conversations that lasted much longer than his usual brief check-ins with family or friends. When he returned to the house, he was quiet and preoccupied, claiming fatigue when I asked about his mood. The following week brought the first direct evidence that my suspicions might be justified. While Robert was out for his usual Wednesday errands, Dorothy stopped by for our regular coffee visit. As we sat in the kitchen discussing our gardens and upcoming spring planting, She mentioned seeing Robert at the corner cafe on Main Street the previous afternoon, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with a younger woman Dorothy didn't recognize. The observation itself wasn't necessarily concerning. Robert occasionally met with former colleagues or conducted business with people I didn't know. However, Dorothy's description of the interaction suggested something more personal than a casual business meeting. The woman had seemed upset or emotional, and Robert had been leaning forward in a posture that suggested intimacy or familiarity rather than professional distance. When Robert returned from his errands that day, I casually mentioned Dorothy's observation, framing it as neighborhood gossip rather than suspicion. His reaction was immediate, and telling a brief flash of panic before he composed himself and explained that he'd met with the daughter of a former colleague who was dealing with some family difficulties related to her father's insurance claims. The explanation was detailed and convincing, but his initial reaction and the speed with which he produced this narrative raised additional red flags. That night, I lay awake reconstructing the conversation and Robert's responses, analyzing his body language and verbal patterns for signs of deception. The exercise felt both necessary and deeply sad, representing a fundamental shift in the trust that had anchored our marriage for over 4 decades. Whether my suspicions were justified or merely symptoms of cognitive decline, the mere fact that I was conducting this kind of analysis indicated that something essential in our relationship had changed irrevocably. The next morning, I made a decision that would prove crucial to everything that followed. Instead of continuing to rely solely on my increasingly unreliable memory, I would begin documenting everything systematically. I purchased a small digital voice recorder and began keeping detailed written logs of conversations, activities, and observations. If my mind was going to betray me, I would create external systems to preserve and analyze information that might be important. This decision marked the beginning of what I now think of as my transformation from victim to investigator. The process of systematic documentation required me to become more observant, more analytical, and more strategic in my daily interactions. Rather than passively accepting explanations for unusual behavior, I began asking follow-up questions, checking details, and looking for corroborating evidence. The first major breakthrough came 3 weeks later when I discovered a small notebook hidden in Robert's workshop. While looking for gardening supplies, I accidentally knocked over a toolbox, spilling its contents across the workbench. Among the scattered items was a notebook containing what appeared to be a timeline of my medical appointments, medication schedules, and legal meetings, along with notes about my daily routines and behavioral patterns. The level of detail was extraordinary and deeply unsettling. Robert had documented not just major events like medical appointments, but minor daily activities like my coffee time with Dorothy, my afternoon reading sessions, and even my bedtime routines. More disturbing were notations about my good days and bad days, with specific attention to instances when my memory seemed particularly unreliable, or when I appeared confused or disoriented. Most alarming was a section titled Capacity Assessment that included Robert's own observations about my decision-making abilities, emotional stability, and awareness of my surroundings. The clinical tone of these notes suggested that Robert was conducting his own evaluation of my cognitive decline, parallel to but separate from my official medical care with Dr. Mitchell. At the bottom of the notebook was a phone number with no name attached, just the notation Wednesday meetings. The number had a local area code but wasn't familiar to me. The regularity of the Wednesday reference connected to Robert's weekly errands and the mysterious ATM withdrawals, suggesting a pattern of activity that was carefully scheduled and deliberately concealed from me. That evening, I photographed every page of the notebook with my phone before carefully returning it to its hiding place in the toolbox. The evidence was disturbing, but I needed to understand the full scope of whatever was happening before taking any action. My instinct was to confront Robert directly, but some deeper wisdom suggested that revealing my discovery prematurely might be dangerous. Instead, I began planning my own investigation, using the systematic skills I'd developed during my library career to research, analyze, and document information methodically. If Robert was conducting some kind of surveillance or assessment of my condition, I would conduct my own investigation of his activities. The difference was that I would be much more careful about covering my tracks. The phone number from Robert's notebook haunted my thoughts for days. Every Wednesday, as he prepared for his mysterious errands, I watched him with new awareness, noting the careful way he checked his appearance in the hallway mirror, the deliberate manner in which he gathered his keys and wallet, and the subtle tension in his shoulders that suggested these weren't casual outings. The man I'd shared breakfast with for 42 years had become a stranger, performing familiar routines while harboring secrets I couldn't begin to fathom. My investigation required careful planning and absolute discretion. The cognitive exercises Dr. Mitchell had recommended for maintaining mental acuity now served a different purpose, sharpening my ability to observe, remember, and analyze patterns of behavior that might reveal the truth about Robert's activities. I began each morning by reviewing my notes from the previous day, cross-referencing observations with documented facts, and planning strategic questions or tests that might yield additional information. The voice recorder became my constant companion, hidden in my sweater pocket during conversations or positioned strategically around the house when Robert made his frequent phone calls. The quality wasn't perfect, but it captured enough detail to verify my recollections and provide evidence if needed later. More importantly, the act of recording gave me confidence that my increasingly unreliable memory wouldn't cause me to miss crucial details or dismiss important observations as mere confusion. 3 days after discovering the notebook, an opportunity for deeper investigation presented itself. Robert announced that he needed to drive to Sacramento to help his brother Thomas with some insurance paperwork, a trip that would require him to stay overnight. The explanation followed his usual pattern of reasonable detail accompanied by subtle discouragement of my involvement, suggesting that the paperwork was tedious and that Thomas preferred to handle family business privately. As soon as Robert's car disappeared around the corner, I retrieved the mysterious phone number from his notebook and dialed it from our landline, my heart pounding with anticipation and dread. The phone rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered, young and slightly breathless, as if she'd rushed to catch the call. "Hello?" I paused, uncertain how to proceed without revealing my identity or purpose. "I'm sorry, I think I may have dialed the wrong number. I was trying to reach someone about a Wednesday appointment." The woman's response was immediate and telling. "Oh, are you calling for Bob? He's not here right now, but I can take a message if you want." The casual familiarity with which she referred to my husband as Bob sent chills through my body. Robert had always preferred his full name in professional contexts and had never encouraged the informal nickname, even among close friends. The fact that this unknown woman used it so naturally suggested a relationship of significant duration and intimacy. "Actually, I think there might be some confusion," I replied carefully. "What kind of appointments does Bob usually have?" There was a long pause before the woman responded, and I could hear uncertainty creeping into her voice. "I'm sorry, who is this?" "Bob usually calls me directly, and I wasn't expecting anyone else to contact me about our meetings." I ended the call without responding, my hands trembling as I replaced the receiver. The conversation had been brief, but it confirmed that Robert was indeed meeting regularly with an unknown woman who expected their relationship to remain private. The casual way she'd mentioned their meetings suggested an established pattern of contact that extended far beyond a simple business relationship. That evening, I sat in my favorite reading chair, ostensibly working on a crossword puzzle while actually processing the implications of what I'd learned. Robert called around 8 o'clock to check in, his voice warm and familiar as he described his day with Thomas and confirmed that he'd be returning home the following afternoon. The normalcy of the conversation felt surreal given what I now suspected about his secret activities. After ending the call, I spent the next 2 hours reviewing every entry in my documentation log, looking for additional patterns or connections that might help me understand the full scope of Robert's deception. The Wednesday meetings were clearly central to whatever was happening, but I needed more information about the woman's identity and the nature of their relationship. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dorothy Williams stopped by the next morning for our usual coffee, but instead of our typical garden chat, she had neighborhood gossip that would prove crucial to my investigation. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind my asking, but is everything all right with Robert lately? I don't want to pry, but I've noticed some unusual activity around your house, and I wanted to make sure you were okay." Dorothy's concern was genuine, and her observational skills were apparently much sharper than I'd realized. She explained that over the past several weeks, she'd noticed a young woman visiting our house on occasions when I wasn't home, always arriving in a silver Honda and staying for an hour or more. The woman appeared to be in her 30s, with dark hair and a professional appearance, and she always parked in our driveway rather than on the street. I assumed she might be some kind of healthcare worker or social service person related to your diagnosis, Dorothy continued. But she never carried any medical equipment or official paperwork, and her visits seemed more social than professional. When I saw her last week, she was crying when she left, and Robert stood in the doorway watching her drive away with an expression I couldn't quite read. The description matched my mental image of the woman from the phone call, and Dorothy's observations provided crucial details about the frequency and nature of these visits. The fact that they occurred specifically when I wasn't home suggested deliberate coordination to avoid my awareness, and the emotional content Dorothy had witnessed indicated a relationship far more complex than simple business meetings. Dorothy, this is going to sound strange, but would you be willing to help me with something? I think Robert might be hiding something important from me, and I need to understand what's happening for my own safety and peace of mind. Dorothy's response was immediate and supportive. As a retired teacher, she understood the importance of careful observation and documentation, and she was genuinely concerned about my welfare given my recent diagnosis. We developed a simple system where she would discreetly monitor activity around my house when I was away and report anything unusual. Over the following week, Dorothy's surveillance provided a clearer picture of the woman's visit pattern. She arrived every Wednesday afternoon around 2 o'clock, usually staying until 4:30 or 5. On 2 occasions, Dorothy observed what appeared to be heated discussions between Robert and the woman, conversations that took place in our backyard, where they couldn't be overheard by neighbors. More disturbing was Dorothy's observation that during these visits, Robert would often retrieve manila folders or documents from his workshop, materials that he would spread out on our patio table while talking with the woman. The content of these documents wasn't visible from Dorothy's vantage point, but their systematic review suggested some kind of planning or coordination that required regular updates and discussion. Armed with this information, I decided to take a more aggressive approach to my investigation. The following Tuesday evening, I told Robert that I was feeling particularly fatigued and planned to spend the next afternoon resting in our bedroom with the door closed, effectively creating an opportunity for his usual Wednesday meeting while giving me the chance to observe from our upstairs window. Robert's relief at my announcement was subtle but unmistakable. He quickly agreed that rest was important for my health and suggested that he might use the quiet time to catch up on some paperwork in the backyard, confirming that he indeed had plans that required my absence from the main areas of the house. Wednesday afternoon arrived with perfect weather for outdoor meetings. I positioned myself at the bedroom window with a pair of binoculars Robert had bought for birdwatching, providing a clear view of our backyard and patio area. At exactly 2 o'clock, the silver Honda pulled into our driveway, and a woman matching Dorothy's description emerged. Seeing her for the first time was a shock that went beyond mere confirmation of suspicions. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with an athletic build and confident bearing that suggested someone accustomed to professional environments. More striking was her physical resemblance to Robert, particularly around the eyes and jawline, features that suggested a familial connection I hadn't anticipated. The woman entered our house through the front door, clearly familiar with the layout and routine. Within minutes, she and Robert emerged in the backyard, and I watched as he retrieved several folders from his workshop exactly as Dorothy had described. They settled at the patio table, and for the next hour I observed what appeared to be a systematic review of documents, with the woman taking notes and asking questions that prompted detailed responses from Robert. Even from a distance, the dynamic between them was obviously close and comfortable, suggesting a relationship of significant duration. The woman's body language indicated familiarity with Robert that extended far beyond professional interaction, and his attentiveness to her questions and concerns suggested emotional investment that made me increasingly uncomfortable. The most disturbing moment came when their conversation became visibly heated. The woman stood up abruptly, gesturing emphatically while speaking in what appeared to be an angry or frustrated tone. Robert responded by reaching across the table to touch her arm, a gesture that seemed to calm her immediately. The intimate nature of this interaction, combined with their obvious physical resemblance, led me to a conclusion that changed everything I thought I knew about my husband's past. This woman was Robert's daughter. The realization hit me like a physical blow, not just because of the secrecy surrounding her existence, but because of the implications for everything else I'd observed. Robert had never mentioned having children from previous relationships, and during our early years together, we'd been completely open about our backgrounds, former relationships, and reasons for not having children of our own. The discovery that he'd hidden the existence of a daughter for the entire duration of our marriage represented a betrayal of trust that went far beyond mere omission. More troubling was the context of her sudden appearance in our lives. The timing of these meetings, beginning shortly after my Alzheimer's diagnosis, suggested that my condition had triggered some kind of planning or decision-making process that required her involvement. The documents they'd been reviewing, the systematic nature of their discussions, and the emotional intensity of their interactions painted a picture of preparation for something that directly concerned my future. As their meeting concluded, I watched the woman gather her papers and embrace Robert in a way that confirmed their familial relationship. The hug lasted longer than a casual goodbye, and when they separated, both appeared emotional, as if they'd been discussing something particularly difficult or consequential. She left through the front door, and Robert remained in the backyard for several minutes, staring at the folders spread across the patio table with an expression of deep concentration. That evening, Robert seemed unusually attentive, asking repeatedly about my well-being, and suggesting that we order dinner from my favorite restaurant rather than cooking at home. His solicitous behavior felt calculated rather than spontaneous, as if he were compensating for something, or managing his own guilt about activities I wasn't supposed to know about. Over dinner, I tested my theory about the woman's identity with carefully indirect questions about Robert's past relationships and family connections. His responses were consistent with the story he'd maintained throughout our marriage, claiming that he had no children and had never been married before our relationship. The ease with which he perpetuated this deception while sitting across from me at our kitchen table was perhaps more disturbing than the original lie itself. That night, I updated my documentation with detailed notes about the afternoon's observations, including sketches of the woman's appearance and descriptions of the documents I'd seen them reviewing. The evidence was building a clear picture of systematic deception, but I still didn't understand the ultimate purpose of these secret meetings or how they related to my medical condition. The answer began to emerge during a conversation with Dr. Mitchell at my next medical appointment. Robert accompanied me as usual, and during the consultation, he asked specific questions about the legal procedures for activating medical power of attorney and making healthcare decisions for someone who was no longer competent to make their own choices. Dr. Mitchell's responses were thorough and professional, but I noticed her glancing at me several times during Robert's questioning, as if gauging my reaction to the discussion. When Robert stepped out to use the restroom, she asked me directly how I felt about these conversations and whether I had any concerns about my care planning. Dr. Mitchell, if someone wanted to make healthcare decisions for me against my will, how would that process work? Her expression became immediately serious. Margaret, are you concerned that someone might try to override your medical autonomy? Because I want you to know that as long as you're mentally competent, which you absolutely are, no one can make medical decisions for you without your explicit consent. I explained my growing concerns about Robert's behavior and his intense interest in the legal aspects of my care, carefully omitting the details about my investigation and the mysterious woman. Dr. Mitchell listened with professional attention, taking notes and asking clarifying questions that suggested she was taking my concerns seriously. Margaret, I'm going to give you some information about protecting your rights as a patient, including how to ensure that your own wishes are respected regardless of what family members might prefer. I'm also going to recommend that you consult with an attorney who specializes in elder law, someone who can help you understand your options for maintaining control over your medical and financial decisions. She provided me with contact information for several attorneys and advocacy resources, materials that I carefully tucked into my purse while Robert was still absent from the room. When he returned, Dr. Mitchell's demeanor was noticeably cooler, and she directed most of her remaining comments to me, rather than including him in the discussion as she had previously. The appointment ended with Dr. Mitchell requesting that I schedule a follow-up visit in 2 weeks, specifically asking that I come alone so that she could assess my cognitive status without any external influences. The request was framed as routine medical care, but her meaningful look as she made the appointment suggested that she understood my concerns and was taking steps to ensure my protection. During the drive home, Robert was unusually quiet, and I sensed that he'd noticed Dr. Mitchell's changed attitude toward him. His questions about the appointment were probing, focusing particularly on her request for a solo follow-up visit and her recommendations about legal planning. I provided vague responses, claiming that I was tired from the medical discussions and needed time to process the information. That evening, I called one of the attorneys Dr. Mitchell had recommended, Michael Rodriguez, and scheduled a consultation for the following week. The conversation was brief, but reassuring, with Mr. Rodriguez confirming that he specialized in protecting the rights of older adults and had extensive experience with cases involving family disputes over medical and financial decision-making. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since the morning I discovered Robert's hidden notebook. What had begun as vague suspicions about unusual behavior had evolved into concrete evidence of systematic deception involving an unknown daughter and apparent planning for my future medical care. The woman's identity was now clear, but her role in whatever Robert was planning remained mysterious and threatening. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a coherent picture, but the complete image was still unclear. I knew that Robert had been meeting secretly with his daughter, that they'd been reviewing documents related to my condition, and that he'd been gathering detailed information about legal procedures for making medical decisions on my behalf. What I didn't yet understand was their ultimate objective or how they planned to implement whatever they were preparing. The investigation that had begun as a way to verify my own perceptions had become a race against time to understand and prepare for whatever Robert and his daughter were planning. My Alzheimer's diagnosis had been intended to make me vulnerable and dependent, but instead, it had awakened survival instincts and analytical skills that I hadn't used since my library career. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities for gathering information and evidence, but tonight, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of discovering that the man I'd trusted with my life and future had been systematically planning something that required such elaborate secrecy and deception. The betrayal was devastating, but the knowledge was empowering, and I was determined to use every remaining moment of mental clarity to protect myself from whatever they had in mind. My meeting with attorney Michael Rodriguez took place on a Tuesday morning when Robert believed I was attending a senior yoga class at the community center. The deception felt strange but necessary, given the circumstances I now found myself navigating. Mr. Rodriguez's office was located in a modest building downtown, and his demeanor immediately put me at ease. He was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and the patient manner of someone accustomed to helping people through difficult family situations. I presented him with copies of my documentation, including photographs of Robert's notebook, transcripts of recorded conversations, and detailed observations about the mysterious woman's visits. Mr. Rodriguez reviewed everything methodically, occasionally asking clarifying questions about timing and specific details. His professional composure never wavered, but I noticed his expression growing increasingly serious as he absorbed the full scope of what I'd uncovered. Mrs. Chen, what you've documented here suggests a pattern of behavior that's quite concerning from a legal standpoint, he said finally. The systematic gathering of information about your medical condition, combined with the secretive nature of these meetings and the focus on legal procedures for medical decision-making, raises some significant red flags about potential exploitation or abuse. He explained that elder abuse often began with seemingly benign activities like the ones I'd observed, gradually escalating as perpetrators gained confidence and opportunity. The involvement of Robert's previously unknown daughter added complexity to the situation, particularly given the timing of her appearance following my diagnosis. I want you to understand that you have rights and options, regardless of your medical condition, Mr. Rodriguez continued. As long as you're mentally competent, which you clearly are, no one can make medical or financial decisions for you without your explicit consent. However, we need to take steps to protect those rights and ensure that your wishes are documented and legally enforceable. He recommended several immediate actions, including updating my will and medical directives to specifically address my concerns, establishing a trusted person advocacy arrangement with someone outside my immediate family, and implementing additional security measures for my financial accounts. More importantly, he suggested that we begin gathering evidence in a more systematic way, using legal tools that would provide admissible documentation if court intervention became necessary. The conversation was both empowering and terrifying. On one hand, I felt relief knowing that legal protections existed and that I wasn't powerless despite my condition. On the other hand, the fact that I needed these protections against my own husband of 42 years was a reality I was still struggling to accept. Mr. Rodriguez arranged for a private investigator to discreetly verify some of the information I'd gathered, particularly regarding the woman's identity and any previous legal relationship between her and Robert. He also provided me with a small recording device designed specifically for elder protection cases, equipment that would capture higher quality audio evidence if needed. The private investigator's report arrived 3 days later, and the findings exceeded my worst fears. Jessica Torres was indeed Robert's daughter, born 35 years ago to a woman named Carmen Torres in San Diego. Robert had been briefly married to Carmen when he was in his early 30s, a relationship that had ended in divorce when Jessica was 2 years old. He had paid child support sporadically for several years before losing contact with both mother and daughter entirely. What made this discovery particularly devastating was the timeline. Robert and I had met just 6 months after his divorce from Carmen, and throughout our courtship and early marriage, he had repeatedly emphasized his desire to start fresh with someone who shared his vision of a child-free lifestyle. The elaborate fiction he'd constructed about his past wasn't merely an omission, but a fundamental deception about who he was and what he wanted from our relationship. Even more disturbing was the information about Jessica's recent circumstances. She was currently unemployed, having lost her marketing job 3 months ago, and was facing significant financial difficulties, including potential foreclosure on her condominium. The timing of her reconnection with Robert, combined with her desperate financial situation and the value of our accumulated assets, painted a clear picture of motivation for whatever they were planning. The private investigator had also uncovered concerning details about Robert's recent activities. He had been researching nursing homes and assisted living facilities, specifically focusing on costs and admission procedures for patients with cognitive impairments. More alarmingly, he had consulted with 2 different attorneys about expediting conservatorship proceedings and had opened a separate bank account that wasn't reflected in our joint financial statements. Armed with this information, I realized that my situation was far more precarious than I'd initially understood. Robert and Jessica weren't just planning to manage my care as my condition progressed. They were actively working to accelerate the process of removing me from my home and gaining control over my assets. The systematic documentation of my cognitive lapses, the research into legal procedures, and Jessica's financial desperation created a perfect storm of circumstances that put me in immediate danger. Mr. Rodriguez's response to the investigator's report was swift and decisive. He recommended that I immediately implement emergency protective measures, including changing my banking passwords, revoking Robert's power of attorney privileges, and establishing a safety plan in case I needed to leave my home quickly. More importantly, he suggested that we needed to gather direct evidence of their planning, preferably recordings of conversations that clearly outlined their intentions. The opportunity for such evidence presented itself sooner than expected. The following Wednesday, instead of positioning myself at the bedroom window as I had previously, I decided to use the new recording equipment Mr. Rodriguez had provided to capture Jessica and Robert's conversation directly. The device was small enough to hide in the patio umbrella, positioned where it would record their usual meeting spot with crystal clarity. My hands were shaking as I placed the recorder in position that morning, partly from nervousness and partly from the magnitude of what I was about to discover. Whatever they discussed today would likely determine my next course of action, and I needed to be prepared for the possibility that their plans were more advanced and more dangerous than I'd imagined. Jessica arrived at precisely 2 o'clock, and within minutes, she and Robert were seated at the patio table with their usual collection of folders and documents. From my position inside the house, I could see them through the kitchen window, but more importantly, I could monitor the recording device to ensure it was functioning properly. Their conversation began with what appeared to be routine updates about my condition and behavior, but within minutes, the discussion took a turn that made my blood run cold. Jessica's voice was clear and determined as she outlined a timeline that would change my life forever. "We need to move faster, Dad. The doctors say she could maintain this level of functioning for years, and we can't wait that long. I'm gonna lose the condo next month if we don't do something." Robert's response was equally chilling. "I understand the pressure you're under, but we have to be careful about the timing. If we move too quickly, it will raise suspicions, especially with that Dr. Mitchell asking so many questions about Margaret's care preferences." "Then we make it look like a medical emergency," Jessica replied without hesitation. "You said the medication interactions could cause confusion and disorientation. If she had a serious episode, something that required immediate intervention, wouldn't that justify emergency guardianship proceedings?" The casual way she discussed manipulating my medication to create a medical crisis was terrifying. But Robert's response was even worse. I've been researching that option. There are several combinations that could cause symptoms severe enough to warrant immediate hospitalization, and once she's in the system as an incompetent patient, the legal procedures become much simpler. How long would it take? Jessica asked, and I could hear papers rustling as they consulted their documents. 2 weeks, maybe 3, from the initial incident to full conservatorship. Once I have legal authority over her medical decisions, we can place her in that facility we looked at in Riverside. It's not the nicest place, but it's affordable, and they're accustomed to dealing with difficult patients. Jessica's laugh was cold and calculating. Difficult patients. Is that what we're calling her now? Margaret won't understand what's happening, Robert continued. The facility specializes in advanced dementia care, so even if she tries to complain or make accusations, no one will take her seriously. Her medical records will show a history of confusion and paranoid thinking. And the house? Jessica pressed. Once she's been declared incompetent, I'll have the authority to sell it to pay for her care. Even after the facility costs, there should be several $100,000 left, plus the life insurance and retirement accounts. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, during which they discussed specific medications that could be used to create cognitive crises, the names of attorneys who specialized in expedited conservatorship proceedings, and the timeline for liquidating our assets once they gained legal control. They talked about my future as if I were already dead, planning the disposal of my life with the same casual efficiency they might use to organize a garage sale. Most devastating was the emotional coldness with which they discussed my welfare. There was no consideration of my preferences, no concern for my comfort or dignity, and no acknowledgement that I was a human being with rights and feelings. I was simply an obstacle to be managed, and an asset to be liquidated as efficiently as possible. As their meeting concluded, Jessica embraced Robert with obvious satisfaction. I knew I could count on you, Dad. Mom always said you were good at solving problems, and this has been a problem for too long. Your mother was right about a lot of things, Robert replied. I should never have lost touch with you after the divorce. We could have been a family again long ago if I hadn't been so focused on this fantasy of a perfect life with Margaret. The revelation that our entire marriage had been a fantasy that prevented him from reconnecting with his real family was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their conversation. For 42 years, I had believed that we were building a life together based on love, trust, and mutual respect. Learning that Robert viewed our relationship as an impediment to his authentic family connections reframed every shared experience and loving gesture as elaborate deception. After Jessica left, I remained frozen in the kitchen, processing the full scope of their plans and the immediate danger I faced. They weren't simply planning to manage my decline or benefit from my eventual death. They were actively preparing to destroy my cognitive function through medication manipulation, have me declared incompetent through fraudulent medical records, and dispose of my assets while warehousing me in a substandard facility where my protests would be dismissed as symptoms of dementia. The timeline they'd discussed was accelerated and urgent, driven by Jessica's financial crisis and Robert's apparent eagerness to access our accumulated wealth. I had perhaps 2 weeks before they would implement their plan, which meant I needed to act immediately to protect myself and gather the evidence necessary to expose their conspiracy. That evening, Robert's behavior toward me took on sinister new meaning. His solicitous questions about my medication schedule, his insistence on managing my pills personally, and his suggestions that I seemed more confused lately were no longer expressions of loving concern, but preparations for medical sabotage. Every interaction was now filtered through the knowledge of what he was planning, making normal conversation feel like a dangerous performance where any misstep might accelerate their timeline. The weight of maintaining this facade while planning my own survival strategy was exhausting, but I knew that revealing my knowledge prematurely would be catastrophic. They had planned for the possibility that I might become suspicious or resistant, and Robert's comments about creating medical records showing, quote, paranoid thinking, suggested that any accusations I made would be dismissed as symptoms of my condition. I needed irrefutable evidence, legal protection, and a safe place to go before confronting them with what I'd discovered. Most importantly, I needed to act quickly, because every day I delayed gave them more opportunity to implement their plan and destroy the life I'd spent decades building. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.